He laughed because he thought she was powerless, but before the night was over, every person in the ballroom would wish they had looked beyond a simple first impression. Grace Bennet stepped out of a rideshare beneath the glowing entrance of the Grand Lexington Hotel just as the evening sun painted the glass towers with shades of gold. She adjusted the strap of her faded canvas bag, smoothed the sleeves of her pale blue cotton blouse, and quietly admired the elegant building before walking toward the revolving doors. At 35 years old, Grace had never believed confidence came from expensive clothing or designer labels. She wore clean white sneakers, dark navy slacks, and a silver watch that had been a gift from her late father years earlier. To most people arriving at the annual education charity gala, she looked like an ordinary woman who had wandered into the wrong place. Luxury cars lined the entrance one after another while photographers captured smiling guests wrapped in tailored tuxedos and sparkling evening gowns. Dalits greeted familiar faces by name, champagne glasses reflected the warm lobby lights, and a string quartet filled the marble hall with gentle classical music. Grace paused for a moment beside the entrance, allowing several guests to pass before quietly stepping inside. She smiled politely at every employee she met, thanking the doorman before making her way toward the registration area. She carried herself with quiet dignity that attracted very little attention, at least at first. Standing only a few feet away was Brandon Hayes, a wealthy real estate developer whose reputation for arrogance had become almost as famous as his success. Surrounded by business partners and admirers, Brandon enjoyed being the center of every conversation. He believed status could be measured by appearance within seconds. As his eyes landed on Grace, a confident grin slowly spread across his face. He leaned toward one of his associates and whispered something that caused several people to chuckle before they even looked in her direction. Grace noticed the laughter but continued walking without changing her pace. She had learned long ago that strangers often revealed more about themselves than about the people they judged. Brandon watched her approach the registration table and shook his head with exaggerated disbelief. "This gala has become much more welcoming than I expected," he remarked loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. A few people laughed politely, unsure whether they should join him. Others simply glanced at Grace before quickly looking away. She remained perfectly calm, offering a warm smile to the volunteer behind the registration desk, who was busy helping another guest. Brandon took another slow sip from his sparkling water and spoke again with playful confidence. "I hope someone remembered to tell her this is a black-tie charity event, not a neighborhood book club." This time the laughter grew slightly louder. Several guests smiled awkwardly while others lowered their eyes, uncomfortable but unwilling to interrupt the wealthy man entertaining the room. Grace heard every word. She neither defended herself nor acknowledged the remarks. Instead, she quietly stepped aside so an elderly couple could check in before her. The volunteer thanked Grace for her patience, and she answered with genuine kindness. Brandon frowned almost imperceptibly. He had expected embarrassment, perhaps even an argument. Instead, the woman he had chosen to mock seemed completely untouched by his performance. That calm unsettled him more than any angry response ever could. Across the magnificent ballroom, hidden beyond towering floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers, someone had just noticed Grace's arrival, and within minutes the entire direction of the evening was about to change in a way no amount of wealth or influence could prevent. Grace waited quietly beside the registration table while volunteers welcomed arriving guests one after another. She never glanced toward Brandon or acknowledged the comments he had made only moments earlier. Instead, she stepped aside whenever another guest approached, smiling warmly as an elderly couple struggled to organize their printed invitations. "Please, go ahead," she said kindly. "There is no rush." The volunteer behind the desk looked at Grace with genuine appreciation. "Thank you for being so patient." Grace answered with a gentle smile. "Everyone is excited tonight. I can certainly wait a few more minutes." Her calm voice contrasted sharply with the growing laughter only a few yards away. Brandon watched the exchange with amusement. Surrounded by several business associates, he enjoyed the attention his jokes attracted. "You have to admire confidence," he announced loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Some people walk into places where they clearly do not belong and act as though they own the room. A few guests laughed politely, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman quietly lowered her eyes, sensing that the remarks had become unnecessarily personal. Brandon mistook the silence for approval. He took another step toward the registration area, adjusting the cuff of his expensive tuxedo before speaking again. "I wonder if she is here looking for free refreshments." His companions chuckled, although the laughter sounded less certain than before. Grace heard every word. She simply thanked the volunteer once more and waited without changing her expression. Years of working with people from every background had taught her something most never discovered. The quickest way to understand another person's character was to watch how they treated someone they believed had nothing to offer in return. The ballroom sparkled beneath enormous crystal chandeliers while servers carried silver trays filled with sparkling water and elegant appetizers. A jazz trio played softly from the stage as donors greeted community leaders, educators, and local business owners. Everything reflected elegance and generosity, yet beneath the polished surface an entirely different lesson was beginning to unfold. Brandon noticed that Grace still had not reacted, and the lack of response irritated him. He had expected embarrassment or frustration. Instead, she remained remarkably composed, almost as though his opinion held no value at all. Determined to reclaim the attention of the room, he walked closer and smiled with exaggerated politeness. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you certain you are attending the correct event? The public library fundraiser is across town." A few nervous laughs echoed through the lobby. Grace looked at him for the first time that evening. Her eyes remained calm, steady, and sincere. "Thank you for your concern," she replied softly. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." There was no sarcasm in her voice, no anger, and no attempt to embarrass him. The simple answer somehow unsettled Brandon more than any clever comeback could have. Before he could respond, the volunteer finally reached for the guest list. She searched carefully through several pages, then paused for a brief moment as though looking for something specific. At that exact instant, across the far end of the ballroom, a distinguished gentleman in a tailored charcoal suit looked up from an important conversation after receiving a quiet message from his assistant. The moment he read the name on the screen, his expression changed completely. Without another word, he excused himself from the city's most influential guests and began walking directly toward the lobby, leaving everyone around him wondering what could possibly be important enough to interrupt the evening's opening ceremony. The distinguished gentleman crossed the ballroom with surprising urgency, weaving politely between guests who instinctively stepped aside. Conversations slowed as several donors recognized him immediately. He was Thomas Whitmore, chairman of the Education Forward Foundation and the respected leader responsible for organizing the evening's charity gala. People rarely saw him interrupt conversations, especially during the opening reception. Yet his attention remained fixed on only one person standing quietly beside the registration table. Grace still waited patiently while the volunteer searched through the guest list. She noticed the chairman approaching but remained perfectly composed, assuming he was simply greeting another important guest nearby. Brandon noticed him as well and straightened his posture with a confident smile. Certain that Thomas was coming to welcome one of the event's largest financial contributors, Brandon adjusted his jacket and prepared to extend his hand. Several people surrounding him expected the same thing. Instead, Thomas walked directly past Brandon without slowing down. The wealthy developer's confident smile froze as the chairman continued toward Grace. The volunteer finally looked up from the registration desk with an expression of sudden realization. "I found your name," she whispered, sounding almost relieved. Before she could continue, Thomas arrived with a warm smile that immediately transformed the atmosphere around them. "Grace," he said sincerely, "thank you for coming. We have been looking forward to seeing you all evening." Grace returned the smile with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Thomas. I hope I am not late." "Not at all," he replied. "The evening would not truly begin without you." Nearby conversation stopped completely. Brandon stared in disbelief as several members of the organizing committee quietly gathered behind the chairman. None of them greeted Grace with exaggerated ceremony. Instead, their respect felt natural, the kind that comes from years of admiration rather than public performance. Grace reached into her canvas bag and removed a simple envelope. "I brought the updated scholarship reports you asked for," she said softly. Thomas accepted it with visible appreciation. "Perfect. The students will be sharing their stories tonight, and I hoped you would have a chance to meet them afterward." Grace nodded gently. "That is always my favorite part." Brandon exchanged confused glances with his business partners. Nothing about the conversation matched the assumptions he had confidently made less than 10 minutes earlier. The woman he had mocked was clearly not an unexpected visitor searching for free refreshments. She seemed to know every senior organizer personally, and they spoke to her with quiet gratitude rather than formal courtesy. The volunteer smiled apologetically. "Mrs. Bennett, I am very sorry for the delay. We were instructed to notify Mr. Whitmore the moment you arrived." Grace answered kindly. "You have been wonderful. There is no need to apologize." Thomas then turned toward one of his assistants. "Please let the board know that Grace is here." The assistant nodded immediately and hurried into the ballroom. Guests watched the scene unfold with growing curiosity. Whispered conversations began spreading from one table to another as people wondered why the foundation chairman had personally welcomed a woman dressed more simply than anyone else attending the gala. Brandon remained silent for the first time that evening. Deep inside, an uncomfortable feeling slowly replaced his earlier confidence. He still did not know who Grace Bennett truly was, but the certainty that had fueled every mocking remark was beginning to disappear, replaced by the unsettling realization that the evening was no longer unfolding according to the story he had so confidently imagined. Whispers spread through the ballroom with remarkable speed as members of the foundation board quietly left their conversations and made their way toward Grace. None of them appeared surprised to see her. Instead, each greeted her with the kind of sincere appreciation that could never be rehearsed. Brandon watched from only a few yards away, trying to convince himself there had to be a simple explanation. Perhaps she was an employee. Perhaps she had volunteered for years. Whatever the answer might be, he refused to believe the woman he had mocked could possibly be one of the evening's most important guests. Thomas Whitmore smiled warmly as he gestured toward the grand ballroom. "Everyone has been asking whether you would be able to attend this year," he said. Grace answered with her familiar humility. "I promised the students I would try my best." Thomas laughed softly. "You always keep your promises." Together they began walking across the marble floor toward the main hall. Guests naturally stepped aside as the chairman accompanied Grace through the elegant entrance. Crystal chandeliers filled the room with warm light while beautifully decorated tables stretched across the ballroom beneath towering arrangements of white roses and blue hydrangeas. A large screen displayed photographs of scholarship recipients whose lives had been transformed through educational opportunities. Grace paused for a brief moment to admire the smiling faces on the screen. Her expression reflected quiet pride rather than personal accomplishment. She seemed happiest looking at the students rather than the elegant surroundings. Brandon slowly followed behind with several of his associates. Their earlier laughter had disappeared completely, replaced by uneasy curiosity. One businessman whispered, "Do you know who she is?" Another quietly shook his head. "No, but everyone important certainly seems to know her." Brandon forced a confident smile. "There is probably a simple explanation." Yet even he no longer sounded convinced. Near the stage, several college students wearing volunteer badges noticed Grace entering the ballroom. Their faces immediately brightened. One young woman hurried over with visible excitement. "Mrs. Bennett," she said gratefully, "I finally graduated this spring." Grace recognized her instantly and smiled with genuine joy. "Emily, congratulations. I knew you would do it." The young graduate's eyes filled with emotion. "I could never thank you enough for believing in me." Grace gently squeezed her hand. "You earned every success through your own determination." Nearby guests quietly watched the exchange, sensing a deeper story without fully understanding it. More former scholarship recipients approached one after another, greeting Grace with heartfelt appreciation instead of formal introductions. Each conversation lasted only a few moments, yet every smile carried years of gratitude. Brandon listened carefully as fragments of those conversations reached him. He heard words like opportunity, encouragement, education, and hope. None of them matched the assumptions he had confidently made when Grace first walked through the hotel doors. Thomas then stepped onto the stage to prepare for the evening's opening remarks. Before adjusting the microphone, he looked toward Grace and nodded respectfully. She returned the gesture with a simple smile before quietly taking a seat near the front of the ballroom instead of accepting one of the reserved places on stage. That single decision caught the attention of everyone watching. The woman receiving the greatest respect in the room had deliberately chosen the simplest chair available. As the lights slowly dimmed and the audience settled into silence, Brandon felt an unfamiliar weight settle in his chest. For the first time in years, he realized he had judged an entire human being within seconds of seeing her clothes, and the truth waiting to be revealed was already beginning to unravel every confident opinion he had expressed that evening. Thomas Whitmore welcomed the audience with a warm smile before the ballroom settled into complete silence. The elegant room, filled only moments earlier with quiet conversations and the gentle sound of music, now focused entirely on the stage. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft golden light across hundreds of guests, while photographs of smiling students remained displayed on the enormous screen behind the podium. Thomas looked around the room before speaking. Every year, he began, we celebrate generosity. But tonight is about something much greater than financial success. It is about people who quietly change lives without asking for recognition. The audience responded with respectful applause. Brandon joined politely, although his attention remained fixed on Grace, who sat quietly near the front beside several student volunteers instead of among the influential donors. Thomas continued. Thousands of students have received scholarships through this foundation. Many have become teachers, engineers, nurses, scientists, and community leaders. Their futures were transformed because one person believed education should never depend on someone's financial circumstances. As those words echoed through the ballroom, several former scholarship recipients smiled toward Grace. Brandon noticed their expressions and felt his curiosity growing stronger with every passing second. Thomas paused before continuing in a noticeably more personal tone. Many people believe the largest donors are those whose names appear on buildings or printed programs. Sometimes that is true. But the greatest generosity often comes from people who never ask for applause. A quiet hush settled across the room. Brandon slowly folded his hands, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Thomas stepped away from the podium for a brief moment and looked directly toward Grace. His smile reflected years of friendship and admiration. There is someone with us tonight whose kindness has changed more lives than most people could ever imagine. Every guest instinctively turned to follow his gaze. Grace looked slightly surprised by the attention and shook her head almost imperceptibly, as though hoping the spotlight would move elsewhere. Thomas smiled gently. She never requests recognition. In fact, she usually asks us not to mention her name at all. But this year, our board unanimously agreed that the students deserve an opportunity to thank the person who believed in them long before anyone else did. The audience remained perfectly still. Brandon felt his heartbeat quicken. Nothing about the evening resembled the confident assumptions he had made when Grace first entered the hotel carrying nothing more than a canvas bag. Thomas spoke once again. More than 12 years ago, after building a successful educational consulting organization, this remarkable woman quietly created the Bennett Opportunity Fund. Since then, she has personally financed thousands of scholarships while insisting that every recipient receive dignity instead of publicity. Audible gasps spread through the ballroom. Several guests instinctively looked back toward Grace with expressions of astonishment. Brandon stared in complete disbelief. His earlier jokes echoed painfully in his own memory. The woman he had dismissed because of simple clothing had spent more than a decade opening doors for young people he had never even noticed. Grace remained seated, her expression unchanged except for a humble smile directed toward the students rather than the audience. She seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. Thomas extended his hand toward her warmly. "Grace, would you please join me on stage?" For a brief moment, the ballroom became so quiet that even the gentle clink of silverware from the distant kitchen could be heard. Every confident opinion Brandon had expressed that evening collapsed beneath a single undeniable truth. The simplest woman in the room had quietly become the most respected person in it. Grace remained seated for another brief moment, almost hoping the attention would pass to someone else. The applause filling the ballroom was sincere, yet she had never been comfortable standing at the center of recognition. Thomas Whitmore smiled encouragingly from the stage. "Please," he said warmly, "this evening belongs to every student whose future changed because you believed in them first." Grace slowly rose from her chair. Several scholarship recipients stood instinctively before anyone else, applauding with genuine gratitude rather than social obligation. One by one, the rest of the audience followed until the entire ballroom was standing. The sound echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers while Grace quietly walked toward the stage with the same calm dignity she had displayed from the moment she entered the hotel. She carried no dramatic expression of triumph. She simply smiled at the students as she passed their tables. Brandon remained standing as well, but his applause slowed until it stopped altogether. His thoughts returned to every careless sentence he had spoken earlier that evening. The expensive tuxedo he had been so proud of suddenly felt meaningless beside the quiet woman whose greatest accomplishment had never been visible in the clothes she wore. Grace stepped onto the stage beside Thomas, who welcomed her with a respectful handshake before turning back toward the audience. "Many people know the Bennett Opportunity Fund," he said. "Very few know the woman who created it insisted her name never appear in advertisements, fundraising campaigns, or public ceremonies. She believed students deserved opportunities, not reminders of who paid for them." Another wave of applause filled the room. Grace lowered her eyes modestly, almost embarrassed by the attention. Thomas smiled before handing her the microphone. "Would you share a few words with us?" Grace accepted it gently and looked across the ballroom. Hundreds of faces watched her with complete attention. She noticed business leaders, teachers, volunteers, students, hotel staff, and finally Brandon standing near the back of the room. For just a moment their eyes met. There was no anger in her expression, only quiet understanding. She looked back toward the audience and spoke softly. "Thank you for your kindness tonight. But I hope you will remember that scholarships are never created by one person. They are built through the generosity of countless people who believe someone they have never met deserves a chance." The audience listened in complete silence. Grace continued. "Education changed my own life many years ago because someone believed in me before I had anything to offer in return. I promised myself that if I ever succeeded, I would spend my life opening doors for others instead of standing in front of them." Several students wiped away quiet tears while teachers exchanged appreciative smiles. Grace never mentioned the uncomfortable moments that had greeted her arrival. She never spoke about judgment, embarrassment, or appearances. Instead, she chose to speak only about hope. Brandon listened to every word, realizing she possessed the perfect opportunity to expose him before the entire ballroom. She could have repeated every joke he had made. She could have described exactly how he had tried to embarrass her. Instead, she refused to mention him even once. That unexpected kindness weighed far more heavily on his conscience than any public criticism ever could have. As Grace returned the microphone to Thomas, the ballroom once again erupted into heartfelt applause, and Brandon finally understood that true greatness never demanded attention because it naturally earned the respect that arrogance could never buy. As the applause gradually faded, guests rose from their tables and began moving through the ballroom for the evening reception. Conversations that had once revolved around business opportunities and investment strategies now centered almost entirely on Grace Bennett. People who had never noticed her when she entered the hotel only an hour earlier now waited patiently for the chance to introduce themselves. Former scholarship recipients embraced one another while proudly telling their families how a single opportunity had changed the direction of their lives. Grace accepted every handshake with the same gentle smile, never allowing the admiration surrounding her to change her quiet manner. She asked students about their careers, congratulated recent graduates, and thanked volunteers for the countless hours they had dedicated throughout the year. Thomas Whitmore watched from nearby with quiet satisfaction. He had seen this scene many times before. Recognition had never transformed Grace because humility had become part of who she was long before success arrived. Across the ballroom, Brandon remained standing beside a tall window overlooking the city lights. His business partners had gradually drifted away, sensing that he needed a moment alone. For the first time in years, Brandon replayed his own words instead of someone else's. Every joke that had seemed harmless only an hour earlier now sounded painfully shallow inside his own memory. He looked toward Grace as she laughed warmly with a group of students whose futures she had helped shape without ever asking for recognition. The contrast between them was impossible to ignore. One had entered the evening hoping to be admired. The other had entered hoping no one would notice her at all. After several long moments, Brandon slowly walked across the ballroom. His confident stride had disappeared, replaced by quiet hesitation. Several guests noticed him approaching Grace and instinctively lowered their voices. Grace had just finished speaking with a young engineering student when she noticed Brandon stopping a respectful distance away. He waited until the conversation had completely ended before speaking. "Mrs. Bennet," he began softly, "may I have a moment of your time?" Grace smiled politely. "Of course." Brandon took a slow breath before continuing. "I owe you a sincere apology. Earlier this evening I judged you before learning anything about you. I allowed appearances to determine how I treated another person, and I was completely wrong." His voice remained steady, but the regret behind it was unmistakable. Several nearby guests quietly listened without interrupting. Grace studied his face for a brief moment. She saw embarrassment, certainly, but she also saw something she had not expected when she first entered the ballroom. She saw honesty. Brandon lowered his eyes before speaking again. "I cannot change what I said. I only hope you will accept my apology." Grace remained silent for a moment before asking one simple question. Her voice stayed gentle, almost curious. "If I had walked through those same doors wearing an expensive designer gown instead of simple clothes, would we have had the same conversation?" Brandon closed his eyes briefly. The answer arrived instantly, and it was not one he could escape. "No," he admitted quietly. "We would not." Grace nodded thoughtfully. There was no satisfaction in her expression, only understanding. "Then perhaps tonight was never really about me." Brandon looked at her in confusion. Grace continued softly, "Sometimes the people we meet simply reveal parts of ourselves that have been waiting to change." Those words settled over the conversation with remarkable calm. They carried no anger, no accusation, and no desire for revenge. Yet Brandon understood that they would remain with him far longer than any public humiliation ever could. Brandon stood in thoughtful silence long after Grace finished speaking. Her words had removed every excuse he might have offered and replaced them with something far more difficult to confront. She had not questioned his success, his career, or his accomplishments. She had simply invited him to examine the difference between appearance and character. Around them, the reception continued as guests shared stories, students celebrated their achievements, and volunteers introduced scholarship recipients to community leaders. Yet for Brandon, the lively ballroom seemed unusually quiet. Thomas Whitmore approached with a welcoming smile. "Grace," he said, "there is someone I would like you to meet." A group of first-year scholarship students stood nearby, each carrying the excitement and uncertainty that came with beginning a new chapter in life. Grace greeted every student by name after reading their name badges, asking about their colleges, their dreams, and their families. She listened far more than she spoke, celebrating every answer with sincere encouragement. Brandon watched from a short distance. None of the students asked Grace about her business achievements. None of them cared what kind of car she drove or what brands she wore. They admired her because she had quietly changed their lives. That realization settled deeply within him. After several minutes, Brandon walked toward Thomas. "May I ask you something?" he said quietly. Thomas nodded. "Of course." Brandon glanced toward Grace before speaking. "Why has she kept all of this hidden for so many years?" Thomas smiled knowingly. Because she never believed generosity should become a performance. Grace often reminds our board that recognition lasts for a moment, but opportunity can change an entire lifetime. Brandon lowered his eyes. I judged her within seconds. Thomas answered gently, many people would have. Very few are willing to admit it. Those simple words lingered in Brandon's thoughts. A few moments later, Thomas returned to the stage for one final announcement. Before we conclude tonight's program, he said, I have one more piece of wonderful news. Thanks to the generosity shown this evening, we have already exceeded our fundraising goal. The audience responded with enthusiastic applause. Thomas continued, because of tonight's support, hundreds more students will receive scholarships next year. Grace smiled warmly from her seat, clearly more excited about the students than the recognition she had received earlier. Inspired by everything he had witnessed, Brandon quietly approached one of the foundation volunteers. He asked for a donation form and spent several minutes completing it without speaking to anyone else. When he finished, he folded the paper and handed it back with a calm expression. Please use this wherever it is needed most, he said simply. The volunteer thanked him sincerely without announcing the amount or drawing attention to his contribution. Grace happened to notice the exchange from across the ballroom. She did not ask how much he had given, nor did she acknowledge it publicly. Instead, when Brandon glanced in her direction, she offered only a small, genuine smile. It was not the smile of someone claiming victory. It was the smile of someone quietly hoping another person had taken the first step toward becoming better than they had been only a few hours before. In that quiet moment, Brandon finally understood that the greatest lesson of the evening had never been about wealth, influence, or reputation. It had been about the extraordinary difference a single act of humility could make when someone found the courage to see another human being before judging what they wore. The evening slowly drew to a close as guests gathered near the ballroom entrance, exchanging warm conversations instead of hurried business cards. The atmosphere felt different from the one that had welcomed them only a few hours earlier. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled above polished marble floors, the music still drifted softly through the elegant hall, and the beautifully decorated tables remained untouched by time, yet something far more meaningful had changed. The people inside the room no longer measured one another by expensive watches, designer clothing, or familiar names. They had witnessed a quiet reminder that genuine greatness often arrived without announcing itself. Grace thanked every volunteer before preparing to leave. She stopped beside the registration desk where the same young volunteer who had greeted her earlier was organizing the remaining guest materials. Thank you for everything tonight, Grace said warmly. The volunteer smiled with heartfelt appreciation. No, Mrs. Bennett. Thank you for reminding all of us why we are here. Grace gently shook her head. We are all here for the same reason. We simply help in different ways. Those simple words stayed with the young volunteer long after Grace walked away. Near the ballroom entrance, Thomas Whitmore accompanied Grace toward the hotel lobby. I know you never enjoy being recognized, he said with a smile. Grace laughed softly. You know me too well. Thomas nodded. Perhaps. But sometimes people need to see the face behind quiet generosity. It reminds them that kindness belongs to ordinary people, not extraordinary legends. Grace considered his words before answering. If tonight encouraged even one person to look beyond appearances, then perhaps it was worth stepping onto the stage. Thomas smiled, knowing she was already thinking about the next group of students instead of the applause she had received. Across the lobby, Brandon stood alone for a brief moment before quietly approaching the hotel entrance. As Grace prepared to leave, he offered one final handshake. This time there was no pride hidden behind his smile, no attempt to impress anyone watching nearby. Thank you, he said sincerely. Grace looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the evening. For what? Brandon answered honestly. For giving me the chance to become a better person instead of becoming an example. Grace smiled gently. Every new day gives us that chance. With those final words, she stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city lights reflected across the quiet streets as she walked toward the same rideshare she had arrived in earlier that evening. Nothing about her appearance had changed. She still carried the same faded canvas bag over her shoulder. She still wore the same comfortable white sneakers and simple blue blouse. Yet everyone who watched her leave understood that true elegance had never depended on what she wore. Inside the ballroom, conversations continued long after Grace had disappeared into the night. Former scholarship recipients shared stories of hope with new students. Volunteers welcomed guests with renewed warmth. Brandon quietly returned to the donation table one final time before leaving, asking how he could continue supporting the foundation in the years ahead. No cameras recorded the moment. No announcements followed. It was simply the beginning of a different way of seeing the world. Years later, many people would forget the luxurious ballroom, the expensive tuxedos, and even the amount of money raised that evening. But they would never forget the quiet woman who arrived dressed like everyone else outside the spotlight and left having transformed an entire room without ever asking for attention. Because true class is never revealed by the labels people wear. It is revealed by the kindness they choose to offer before they know who is standing in front of them.